So imagine you're stuck in the world's absolute worst traffic jam.
Oh, man. Yeah. We've all been there.
Right. You've been sitting there for hours. The heat is just shimmering off the asphalt. Tempers are flaring. People are leaning on their horns.
Just completely miserable.
Exactly. You're gripping the steering wheel, completely paralyzed. But then the radio announcer comes on and says, the accident ahead has been completely cleared.
Oh, the best feeling.
Right. The road is officially open. You let out this massive sigh of relief. You put the car in drive. And then you realize something.
You're still not moving.
Your car still isn't moving. The cars in front of you aren't moving. The official reports say you are free, but your physical reality is still just a solid wall of stationary metal.
Which is incredibly frustrating.
It is. And today we are looking at the ultimate global traffic jam. The absolute mother of all bottlenecks, which is the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, this is a huge one.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. We are breaking down a really fascinating dissection of global energy markets today. This is coming from the Dutch financial press. Specifically, a teardown by energy reporter Theo Besteman and energy expert Jules Van Boekel.
And the timeline they analyze in this source material is just pure whiplash.
It really is.
Yeah.
We are talking about going to bed on a Tuesday night, facing, well, an apocalyptic all-out war scenario involving the U.S. and Iran.
Right.
And then you wake up on Wednesday morning to a sudden sweeping ceasefire announcement.
Which, immediately flips the narrative.
Exactly. Within hours, the financial markets are breathing this massive sigh of relief. Stock tickers light up green, the panic subsides, and I think the general public just assumes the crisis is averted.
Yeah, that's the natural reaction. You see the headlines and you think, okay, we're safe.
But the actual physical reality on the water tells a completely different story. And our mission today is to look past that immediate relief of the ceasefire and understand the hidden mechanics of global energy.
Because the reality is so much more complicated than a press release.
It really is. We want to uncover why political announcements don't instantly fix physical supply chains, why wealthy Western nations might be suffering from some really dangerous complacency, and what this all means for your wallet, your economy, and our collective energy future.
Yeah, it's a critical disconnect. The disconnect between political rhetoric and maritime reality is, honestly, arguably the most dangerous blind spot in the global economy right now.
Completely agree. So let's talk about the actual geographical choke point.
Right.
Because you look at the maritime tracking data from the period following that ceasefire announcement, and the Strait of Hormuz is practically empty.
Which is wild because it's responsible for a massive percentage of the world's daily oil flow.
Exactly. We are talking about maybe 5 ships a day passing through.
And those 5 vessels, they weren't Western mega tankers.
Wow.
They were predominantly bulk carriers and non-Western tankers. They were heading to destinations like China or India.
Nations that maintain distinct geopolitical ties with Iran.
Right, they have existing agreements. Every other major player in the global logistics network was just completely paralyzed.
The backlog numbers in the source are staggering. The tracking data shows roughly 3,800 ships just anchored, just waiting.
Wow. 3,800.
And out of those, 800 are fully loaded with oil and gas.
That's just an immense amount of energy sitting idle.
800 floating bombs of energy completely stalled, burning bunker fuel just to keep their systems running while they wait.
It's crazy.
So the politicians are on television saying the waterways are safe, but ship captains and the logistics operators back at corporate headquarters, they don't trade on political tweets.
No, they absolutely do not. They trade on physical security and fear.
So why aren't the ships moving if the politicians said it's safe? Can you clarify this disconnect for us?
Yeah, absolutely. The mechanism holding those 800 ships back isn't a physical blockade. Like, there isn't a literal wall of ships stopping them. It's the global insurance market.
Yeah, okay. The insurance market.
Right. The entire maritime shipping industry operates at the mercy of underwriters. These are primarily organizations tied to Lloyd's of London and the Joint War Committee.
The people who actually calculate the financial risk.
Exactly. They evaluate the physical risk of a waterway. When a geopolitical crisis flares up, they don't look at a ceasefire press release. They look at physical indicators. For instance, right after the ceasefire was announced, there were coordinated drone strikes on the Saudi Yanbu pipeline.
Which is the ultimate red flag.
It really is.
Because the Yanbu pipeline is the strategic bypass route. Like, if the Strait of Hormuz is compromised, Saudi Arabia's contingency plan is to pump crude overland through the east-west pipeline system, which includes Yanbu, terminating at the Red Sea to completely bypass the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, it's their escape hatch.
So striking that specific infrastructure immediately after a ceasefire is a very clear signal that the conflict is not paused.
Not at all.
The threat is highly active, highly targeted, and specifically aimed at energy logistics.
And the insurance underwriters, they react to that physical reality by immediately revoking standard coverage.
Wow. Just like that.
Just like that. Or they jack up what are called war risk premiums to astronomical levels.
How astronomical are we talking?
Well, a standard voyage through the Persian Gulf might carry a totally negligible insurance premium. But in a hot zone, underwriters can demand premiums that equal a significant percentage of the vessel's total hull value.
So we are talking millions of dollars in unexpected costs for a single transit.
Exactly, assuming the underwriter will even write the policy in the first place.
Right.
Companies like Maersk or MSC, they simply cannot legally or financially risk a $100 million vessel, it's billion-dollar cargo, and obviously the lives of its crew in waters where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard might be actively deploying sea mines or conducting boardings.
So without that insurance certificate, the port authorities won't let you dock, the buyers won't accept liability, and the ship physically cannot move.
That is exactly it. Full maritime security is the only thing that matters.
This brings us to a fascinating detail from the source, this legal trap embedded in the standoff.
Oh yeah, the toll proposal.
Right, there was a proposed scenario circulating where Iran might allow tankers through the choke point, provided the shipping companies paid a seemingly nominal toll.
And the figure thrown around was $1 per barrel.
No, $1. I mean, on a standard, very large crude carrier holding 2 million barrels, that's a $2 million toll.
Which sounds like a lot to a normal person.
But considering the cargo is worth a couple $100 million, $2 million is basically a rounding error.
It is peanuts.
It seems like the obvious, pragmatic business decision to just pay the toll and clear the traffic jam, right? Just hand over the $1 per barrel.
It seems that way, yeah. But the mechanics of the global financial system make that completely impossible. It is a brilliantly designed geopolitical snare.
Okay, unpack that for me. Why is it a snare?
Because the financial cost is entirely irrelevant here. The issue is the jurisdictional weaponization of the U.S. dollar and international sanctions. If a Western shipping conglomerate or a major oil company pays a $2 million toll directly to an entity controlled by the Iranian state, they trigger an immediate catastrophic legal mechanism.
Because you aren't just handing over a briefcase of physical cash.
Exactly. Global maritime transactions are processed electronically, and they are usually denominated in U.S. dollars.
Right, which means the payment has to be routed through the correspondent banking system.
Yes. The moment that $2 million transaction hits a U.S. clearinghouse or touches the SWIFT messaging network, the algorithms run by the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, flag it.
And you have now provided material financial support to a heavily sanctioned state entity.
And the penalties for that are just absolute. OFAC can level secondary sanctions against the shipping company.
Meaning what, exactly?
That means the U.S. Treasury can freeze the company's global assets, ban them from utilizing the U.S. financial system entirely, and effectively force any other global bank to cut ties with them.
Or risk being sanctioned themselves.
Exactly. A shipping company would be committing corporate suicide to pay that $1 toll.
Wow.
Iran knows this perfectly well. By demanding the toll, they force Western companies into an impossible corner.
Either violate international sanctions and destroy your company,
or publicly acknowledge that the Iranian state maintains absolute, unyielding control over the world's most critical energy artery.
It's a beautifully ruthless maneuver.
It really is.
So the ships remain anchored, the toll goes unpaid, and the physical supply of oil effectively freezes up.
Right.
Which perfectly explains this massive discrepancy in how oil is priced depending on when you need it.
Yes, the spot market versus the futures market.
Because if you turn on the news right now, you see Brent crude scrolling across the ticker at, let's say, $100 a barrel.
Yeah.
The anchors are pointing to that number to signal that the ceasefire is holding and markets are stabilizing. But according to source material, that number is a complete mirage.
The ticker price is fundamentally a measure of optimism. The $100 price flashing on the screen represents the futures market.
Which is the price a buyer is agreeing to pay for oil delivered 3 months from now.
Exactly. Traders buying those futures contracts are making a collective, highly leveraged guess that over the next 90 days, diplomatic back channels will succeed, the insurance premiums will normalize, the strait will reopen, and global supply chains will heal.
So it is a paper market trading on the expectation of future calm.
Yes, exactly. But the spot market, which is the actual physical market for oil that needs to be delivered to a refinery immediately, that is operating in a state of absolute panic.
Right. If I'm understanding this, the price we see on TV is basically a collective guess about a calmer future. But the spot price is the panic buying price of today, like buying a winter coat in July versus buying one during a blizzard.
That is a perfect analogy. The data shows that the spot price for physical delivery is trading at a massive $10 to $13 premium over the futures price.
So you aren't paying $100, you're paying $113 per barrel.
At least. And in highly vulnerable markets like India, which lacks deep strategic petroleum reserves and relies heavily on continuous imports, the spot price for immediate delivery has spiked to $150 a barrel.
That is a staggering difference.
It is. That phenomenon is known as severe backwardation. When the physical spot price wildly eclipses the future paper price, it indicates that the market is just starving for immediate supply.
The supply chain is so stressed that buyers are willing to pay punitive premiums just to keep their physical infrastructure running today.
Regardless of what the price might be tomorrow.
This has to put the people actually buying the oil, the commodity traders at these massive trading houses, in an incredibly brutal psychological and financial vice.
Oh, absolutely. The Dutch analysts in the source refer to it as a spagat.
A spagat.
Yeah, it translates to a painful split.
Wow.
Think about the trading floor reality. You have a procurement trader responsible for feeding a massive European refinery complex. They are staring at their terminal every single morning, knowing their refinery consumes hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. If they buy on the spot market today at $150 a barrel, they secure the physical molecules of oil. The refinery stays alive.
But if that political ceasefire actually holds, the ships start moving tomorrow and the physical supply gluts the market.
The price will instantly crash back to $80 or $90.
And that trader has just locked their company into a multi-million-dollar loss by buying at the absolute peak of the panic.
Exactly. It's a high-stakes gamble.
But the alternative is equally terrifying. Right?
Well, for sure. If the trader holds off, hoping the ceasefire holds and they can capture the cheaper futures price in a few weeks, they are gambling the physical integrity of their refining infrastructure.
Because if the ceasefire collapses, a tanker is struck, and the strait closes indefinitely, the spot price could leap to $200.
At that point, the trader has no physical oil and they can't afford to buy any.
And you can't just turn off a refinery.
No, a refinery is not a light switch. Modern refineries operate at extreme temperatures and pressures. If the flow of crude stops, the massive catalytic cracking units cool down, the heavy crude inside them solidifies.
It just turns to rock.
Pretty much. The internal piping contracts. Shutting down a refinery unplanned causes millions of dollars in physical damage and requires weeks of meticulous maintenance to restart.
So the trader is literally balancing the financial survival of their trading desk against the physical survival of a multi-billion-dollar industrial asset.
It is a brutal position to be in.
And the truly chilling part of this geographical reality is the massive time delay built into the system.
Yeah, the delay is crucial here.
Because it takes roughly 6 weeks for a very large crude carrier to load at a terminal like Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia, navigate the Persian Gulf, travel down the coast of Africa, round the Cape of Good Hope, and finally arrive at the port of Rotterdam in northwest Europe.
That time lag acts as a buffer, but it's also a total illusion.
How so?
Because the oil that is physically unloading at Rotterdam terminals today was purchased, loaded, and insured 6 weeks ago.
Right.
It represents a snapshot of global stability from a month and a half in the past, long before the current crisis peaked.
So the true pain of the current stoppage won't hit the physical European market until weeks later.
Exactly. The physical European market is currently living on borrowed time.
It's the equivalent of watching a massive tsunami form 50 miles offshore. The beach you are standing on is completely dry right now. The sun is shining.
But you know the physics of the ocean dictate that a wall of water is already traveling toward you.
Exactly. The consequence of those 3,800 ships sitting idle won't truly physically manifest in Europe for another month.
Yes.
Which brings us to how governments and central banks model this incoming wave. Because understanding how volatile these prices are leads directly into how governments try to plan for them.
And sometimes fail to plan for them.
Right. The source outlines 3 distinct scenarios from global energy intelligence firms, specifically consultants like Rystad.
Yeah. The baseline modeling is critical for understanding national security preparations.
Let's walk through them.
Rystad's first model is the mild scenario. This assumes the geopolitical tensions de-escalate rapidly. The Strait of Hormuz clears within weeks.
Okay, so best case scenario.
Right. In this world, prices might hover near the $100 mark momentarily, but over a 6-month horizon, they gradually soften to a decline of $70 to $175 a barrel.
Which is still higher than pre-crisis levels, right?
Yes. Even this best-case scenario establishes a new, higher floor for global energy costs. The sheer realization of the supply chain's fragility bakes a permanent geopolitical risk premium into the market.
Because everyone now knows how fast it can all shut down.
Exactly.
Then we have the medium scenario.
Right. This models an environment of chronic volatility. The strait opens, but navigation is periodically interrupted by asymmetrical warfare.
A rogue drone strike here, a contested vessel inspection there.
Exactly. The insurance markets remain highly stressed. In this model, crude peaks around $105 to $110 a barrel, and the global economy endures a full 12 months of inflationary pressure before supply chains adapt and normalize.
Okay, that sounds bad, but manageable maybe. But then there is the black scenario.
The catastrophic tail-end risk.
Right.
This assumes the ceasefire is a complete failure, diplomatic channels disintegrate, and the Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed to commercial shipping for a sustained period of 4 to 6 months.
Wow.
Under these conditions, the structural deficit of global oil supply cannot be offset by strategic reserves or increased production elsewhere. Global consultants project the price per barrel rocketing past $200.
$200 a barrel. I mean, that fundamentally breaks the modern industrial economy.
It absolutely does.
At that price point, the cost of transportation, aviation, manufacturing, and agricultural production skyrockets to a degree that triggers hyperinflationary shocks and massive corporate defaults.
Yeah, it's a nightmare scenario.
But the genuinely alarming revelation in the analysis is how the government is preparing for this.
Or rather, how they aren't preparing for it.
Right. The Dutch central bank, the DNB, is tasked with stress testing the economy and building the macroeconomic safety nets. But their internal modeling for a worst-case scenario caps the price of oil at $140 per barrel.
Which is it's a huge oversight. The discrepancy between the energy industry's $200 projection and the central bank's $140 cap reveals a profound institutional blind spot.
Wait, so the experts are saying the worst-case scenario is $200, but the government's emergency plan only goes up to $140.
Yes.
That's like buying flood insurance that only covers the first foot of water when a tsunami is coming. Are they just being self-righteous?
It is a failure of imagination rooted in a deeply ingrained cultural and economic complacency.
Unpack that word, complacency.
Well, the bureaucratic machinery of Western Europe, and broadly the Western world, has operated for the last 70 years under a very specific macroeconomic assumption regarding resource acquisition.
The assumption that Western wealth guarantees supply.
Exactly. We are rich, therefore we can always outbid poorer nations for resources. They assume the free market will always save them.
During technical briefings to Parliament mentioned in the source, government officials actively deployed this logic to calm the public.
They did.
They argued that oil and diesel are highly fungible, globally traded commodities on liquid markets. Their narrative was basically that if the Persian Gulf shuts down and prices spike, the invisible hand of the market will simply redirect tankers away from developing nations in Asia or Africa and send them to Rotterdam because European buyers will effortlessly pay the premium.
And this relies on a fundamentally outdated understanding of how the global commodity trade functions today.
It ignores the shifting global dynamics.
Totally. They are applying a 1990s unipolar economic framework to a highly fractured multipolar reality.
Which brings us to the elephant in the room, China.
Yes. The belief that wealth automatically guarantees supply completely ignores the rise of state-coordinated capital, particularly the mechanisms deployed by China.
Because China doesn't play by the same free market rules.
Not at all.
The tactics utilized by the Chinese state shatter the illusion of a purely price-driven free market. The analysis points out that Beijing recently issued direct mandates to its massive state-owned energy enterprises.
Companies like Sinopec and CNPC.
Right. Mandating them to aggressively accumulate fuel supplies on the global market. And the critical directive was to hoard this supply despite record-high prices.
That directive fundamentally alters the bidding war.
Because a Western multinational energy company is beholden to quarterly earnings reports, right?
Right.
Shareholder dividends, strict margin requirements.
Right. They have to turn a profit. When a Western trader looks at a $113 spot price, they hesitate. They run the margins, see that refining that crude into diesel will result in a net loss at current retail prices, and they step back from the market.
They wait.
Yes. But a Chinese state-owned enterprise does not operate under those constraints.
The state looks at the macroeconomic landscape and prioritizes national security, social stability, and uninterrupted industrial output over short-term corporate profit.
Exactly. They will happily absorb the financial loss on the spot market today to guarantee physical supply tomorrow.
So the European bureaucratic assumption that they can easily outbid Asia is entirely hollow.
It's completely hollow.
You are no longer bidding against a private company operating on razor-thin margins. You are bidding against the sovereign treasury of the world's second-largest economy.
An economy which has explicitly decided that energy security is an existential imperative.
And furthermore, Chinese buyers already sit on extreme reserves, far outpacing what European nations hold. They have these structurally massive strategic petroleum reserves that are heavily shielded from public auditing.
Giving them an enormous physical buffer that European nations just lack.
Right.
But the breakdown of the unified free market extends beyond just purchasing power. It bleeds deeply into shifting geopolitical alliances.
Because we are moving toward a fractured world where allied nations prioritize each other.
Yes, we are entering an era where long-term strategic relationships dictate trade flows more than spot market currency.
If the global supply pool shrinks drastically due to a prolonged closure of Hormuz, producing nations in the Middle East will have to ration their exports.
And in that scenario, a producer might look at a lucrative spot market bid from Europe and actively reject it.
Wait, really? They would turn down the higher bidder?
Yes, to prioritize fulfilling long-term supply contracts with allied nations in Asia.
Because they calculate that securing a decades-long strategic and infrastructural partnership with Beijing is vastly more valuable than a short-term cash injection from a European buyer.
Exactly. When statecraft and geopolitics take the wheel, the invisible hand of the market is tied behind its back.
That is fascinating. But it's not just politics, right? This geopolitical vulnerability is compounded by an immense physical infrastructural constraint that the public, and apparently many policymakers, completely misunderstand.
Oh, totally. It centers on the profound chemical complexity of crude oil itself.
This is a crucial point to unpack. The average person, when they pump gas into their car, thinks of crude oil as a singular, uniform substance.
Black gold.
Right. It comes out of the ground, goes into a factory, and turns into fuel.
But the reality of petroleum geology is that there are roughly 250 distinct commercial grades of crude oil globally.
250 types of oil.
Yes, and they possess wildly varying chemical properties.
So we can't just treat oil like it's all one flavor of ice cream.
No, absolutely not.
I like to use the analogy of roasting coffee for this.
No, that's a good one.
Yeah, if you operate a commercial coffee roastery, you calibrate your massive, expensive roasting machines to a very specific type of bean. Let's say you roast a light, delicate Ethiopian bean. It requires a specific temperature, a specific airflow, and a precise roasting time.
Right, very precise.
If your supplier suddenly cuts you off, and someone hands you a shipment of dense, oily, dark roast Sumatran beans, you can't just dump them into your machine.
No, you ruin it.
If you do, you'll burn the beans, ruin the batch, and potentially damage the equipment. You have to completely strip down the roaster, change the thermal profiles, and recalibrate the entire mechanical process.
And that analogy translates perfectly to the chemical engineering of a petroleum refinery.
How so?
Well, oil is categorized primarily by its density, measured by API gravity, and its sulfur content, referred to as sweet or sour.
Okay, so light and sweet or heavy and sour?
Exactly. You have American West Texas Intermediate, which is a light, sweet crude. It flows easily, has low sulfur, and is relatively simple to distill into high-value products like gasoline.
That's the delicate Ethiopian bean.
Right. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have heavy, sour crudes like those from Venezuela or certain Middle Eastern fields.
The dark roast Sumatran.
Exactly. This is incredibly dense, highly viscous sludge loaded with sulfur and heavy metals.
So if our refineries are built for thick sludge and someone hands us light crude, we can't just flip a switch.
Not at all. To process that heavy sludge, you need an intensely complex refinery. You need massive vacuum distillation units to boil the oil at lower pressures without burning it. You need specialized hydrotreating facilities to strip out the sulfur using hydrogen gas.
It's a massive industrial undertaking.
You need highly advanced fluid catalytic crackers to literally break the long hydrocarbon chains into smaller, usable molecules.
And the Netherlands, according to the source, possesses some of the most sophisticated, highly complex refining infrastructure on the planet.
Yes, the refineries in Rotterdam are engineering marvels specifically calibrated to process incredibly heavy, difficult crudes from Russia and the Middle East, converting them into diesel and chemical feedstocks.
So if the Strait of Hormuz closes, and that specific heavy crude stops arriving, the government cannot simply point to American light crude and say, problem solved, use this instead.
No. If you feed light sweet crude into a refinery built for heavy sour sludge, the chemical process entirely breaks down. The distillation towers will flood, the thermal balances will fail, and the output will be completely distorted.
So how long does it take to fix that? To switch a major Rotterdam refinery from processing a Middle Eastern heavy sour to an Atlantic Basin light sweet?
It requires weeks of meticulously planned downtime.
Weeks.
Weeks. You have to safely vent the volatile gases, flush the miles of internal piping, change out the proprietary chemical catalysts in the reactors, and slowly bring the massive furnaces back up to completely different operational temperatures.
It shatters the government's soothing narrative that oil is easy to transport, so we'll be fine.
Exactly. It highlights the ultimate paradox of hyper-optimized industrial systems.
Which is?
Over the decades, these refineries were optimized to the absolute limits of chemical efficiency to maximize margins on very specific, cheap, heavy crudes. But in achieving maximum efficiency, they completely sacrificed flexibility.
The physical reality of the infrastructure makes the narrative mechanically false. Money cannot alter the laws of thermodynamics or bypass weeks of required engineering downtime.
No amount of money can fix that overnight.
But while the world fixates on oil, because we see gasoline prices every day, there is a much more structural, silent crisis brewing in another sector.
The hidden crisis.
Yes, the focus in the media is heavily on oil, but experts in the source warn that natural gas is the bigger problem.
And the European gas network represents a critical, silent vulnerability. The Dutch context is a perfect microcosm for the broader European dilemma here.
Let's get into the history of that, because it's important. For decades, the Netherlands operated a heavily insulated gas-dependent economy.
Right, historically relying on the Groningen gas field since 1959.
It was one of the largest natural gas fields in the world. It powered their industries, heated their homes, and funded their social systems.
It created a cultural assumption of limitless, cheap, domestic energy.
But due to severe seismic activity, literal earthquakes caused by decades of extraction, the Groningen field has been systematically shut down.
So the domestic safety net is gone.
Exactly. Europe is now fundamentally dependent on imports, specifically liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
And the geopolitical shockwaves hitting the oil market are hitting LNG even harder.
The data indicates that Qatar, one of the world's absolute titans of LNG export, has suffered a 17% drop in production.
And a bureaucratic analysis of that number might look at a spreadsheet and determine it isn't a crisis.
Right. A Dutch official might note that the Netherlands only sources roughly 3% of its total gas directly from Qatar.
So a 17% reduction on a 3% baseline seems mathematically insignificant.
But that spreadsheet logic completely ignores the physical reality of the European gas grid.
Because the European grid is deeply interconnected.
Right. It's an incredibly complex, interconnected system of high-pressure pipelines crossing multiple national borders. Gas flows dynamically based on pressure differentials and market demand.
So while the Netherlands only buys 3% directly from Qatar, they are deeply integrated with the Belgian gas network.
Importing massive volumes through interconnectors.
Right. And Belgium relies heavily on Qatari LNG arriving at terminals like Zeebrugge.
So if Qatari production drops by 17%, fewer specialized cryogenic LNG carriers arrive in Belgium.
The Belgian grid pressure drops, forcing them to pull more gas from their neighbor.
Which immediately drains the Dutch system.
Which in turn ripples into the massive industrial demands of Germany. The European gas market is inextricably knotted together.
A supply shock in Doha causes a pressure drop in Dusseldorf within days.
Exactly.
It's kind of an out-of-sight, out-of-mind thing. We feel the oil crisis every time we fill up our cars, but we don't tank up our houses with gas every week, so we underestimate the vulnerability.
Yeah, you only notice it when the bill comes or when the heat doesn't turn on.
But what makes the gas crisis significantly more terrifying than the oil crisis is the absence of a safety net.
Right, the lack of strategic reserves.
With oil, Western nations hold strategic emergency reserves. The U.S. has salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana filled with millions of barrels of crude.
And the analysis notes that nations are currently coordinating the release of up to 20% of these strategic reserves onto the market to artificially suppress the spot price and stabilize the refineries.
So we have a shock absorber for oil.
But for natural gas, that state-managed shock absorber essentially does not exist.
Why aren't the gas companies buying up everything they can right now to fill the tanks?
Well, the vast majority of gas storage infrastructure in Europe consists of commercial facilities, depleted gas fields or salt caverns operated by private energy companies.
Oh, private companies.
Right. These companies fill the storage during the summer when prices are historically lower and withdraw from it during the winter heating season.
But towards the end of the winter cycle, those commercial storages can dwindle to 5% capacity.
Exactly. Because it is a purely commercial enterprise, it is fully exposed to the brutal logic of the spot market we discussed earlier.
Right. The private utilities managing these storage facilities are looking at the skyrocketing spot price of LNG, and they are trapped in their own spigot.
Their own painful split. If they buy massive volumes of LNG today at peak crisis prices to fill the storage caverns, they are taking on enormous financial risk.
Because it hurts their bottom line.
Right. If the geopolitical tension breaks and prices plummet in 2 months, they are left holding vastly overpriced inventory, wiping out their margins for the entire year.
So the corporate strategy is just to wait.
They delay purchasing, playing a game of chicken with the global market, hoping prices will fall before the winter injection season officially begins.
But while corporate entities wait to protect their balance sheets, the physical security of the citizen is completely eroded.
There is no sovereign reserve to mandate injections.
So if a cold front hits and commercial storages are at 5%, the system breaks.
The physical physics of the grid begin to fail. The pressure drops too low to maintain flow to the distribution networks.
And the market's mechanism for resolving that physical shortage is ruthlessly unforgiving.
It is brutal.
There is a quote highlighted in the analysis from an energy trader that perfectly encapsulates this dark reality. He said, "The best cure for high prices is high prices."
It sounds like a circular paradox, but it is the foundational law of commodity economics.
Meaning eventually, people will just be forced to use less because they can't afford it.
The mechanism they are describing is demand destruction.
Demand destruction.
When supply cannot physically meet demand, the price escalates until it forcibly removes consumers from the market. The cure isn't finding more gas. The cure is making the gas so prohibitively expensive that people and industries are economically forced to stop using it.
In human and industrial terms, demand destruction is catastrophic.
It really is.
It means massive energy-intensive industries, like aluminum smelters, glass manufacturers, and fertilizer plants, look at their utility bills and realize the cost of energy exceeds the value of the product they are making.
They power down the furnaces, halt production, and furlough thousands of workers.
It means agricultural supply chains break down because the cost of nitrogen fertilizer, which is derived directly from natural gas, triples in price.
And it means millions of lower-income citizens sit in freezing homes because they physically cannot afford to turn on the thermostat.
The market successfully balances the ledger and brings the price down. But it does so by breaking the back of the working class and gutting the industrial base.
And faced with this grim reality of geopolitical hostage-taking and brutal demand destruction, the political class inevitably pivots to the ultimate escape hatch.
The energy transition.
Yes.
Because if fossil fuels are this volatile and vulnerable, the obvious answer is the energy transition. The political rhetoric suggests that if we just speed up the transition to green energy, we won't have to deal with these geopolitical shocks.
Decouple from the Middle East, electrify the grid, and hit the net zero targets by 2050. The rhetoric is highly seductive.
And to be fair, the technical capabilities of early adoption are genuinely impressive. The Netherlands is highly advanced in early adoption.
Yeah, we are talking about staggering statistics. 1 in 3 residential rooftops outfitted with solar panels.
They have one of the densest electric vehicle charging networks in the world. Institutions like TU Delft are pioneering next-generation battery chemistries.
Massive industrial players like Tata Steel are actively plotting the transition from coal-fired blast furnaces to hydrogen-based direct reduction for green steel.
Right, toxic green steel. The innovation pipeline is undeniable.
The technological progress is real, but the political narrative profoundly misrepresents the scale and the timeline required for heavy industrial transition.
Because the timeline of that transition reveals another set of blind spots.
It is relatively simple, albeit expensive, to subsidize residential solar panels or transition a fleet of suburban commuter cars to lithium-ion batteries.
But you cannot run massive port infrastructure, cargo ships, or the chemical industry on a few solar panels.
You absolutely cannot. The physical constraints are insurmountable in the short term.
Let's look at the maritime sector as an example.
Okay, a massive Maersk Tripoli-class container ship relies on thousands of tons of high-sulfur marine bunker fuel to cross the Pacific.
Right.
The energy density of marine fuel is exponentially higher than the most advanced lithium-ion batteries available.
So if you attempted to power that vessel with batteries to achieve the same range,
the sheer weight and volume of the batteries would displace nearly all of the commercial cargo. The ship would exist solely to transport its own propulsion system.
which defeats the entire purpose of a cargo ship.
Exactly, and the same physical limitations apply to the agricultural sector, which is deeply analyzed in the discussion.
Right. The crisis is acutely impacting the agricultural bedrock right now. As the source points out, farmers are struggling with the cost of red diesel.
Which is standard gas oil that is chemically dyed with markers to indicate it is tax-exempt for off-road agricultural and construction use.
Right. The modern combine harvesters and heavy tractors required to farm at a commercial scale require massive torque and continuous operation during harvest windows.
You can't just tell a farmer whose margins have been obliterated by the geopolitical spike in red diesel prices to electrify his fleet overnight.
Right. The heavy-duty electric agricultural machinery does not exist at scale, the charging infrastructure in rural areas is non-existent, and the capital expenditure to replace a fleet of diesel tractors would bankrupt them instantly.
Similarly, the source points out that commercial fishing fleets are remaining tethered to the docks.
Because fishermen aren't sailing, because diesel is too expensive.
The cost of marine diesel has exceeded the market value of the fish they catch. Electrifying a deep-sea trawler while maintaining refrigeration and hauling winches is currently science fiction.
So the idea that we can just green our way out of this specific crisis is a fantasy.
Yes. The 2050 targets represent a vital long-term trajectory for structural decarbonization, but they provide absolutely zero insulation against the economic shocks of the next decade.
Fossil fuels will fundamentally remain the load-bearing pillars of global logistics, agriculture, and industry for a long time.
And even if we manage to achieve total electrification by mid-century, the geopolitical vulnerability doesn't vanish. It simply mutates.
Wait, what do you mean it mutates? We are trading our oil overlords for battery overlords.
Exactly. If we successfully eradicate our reliance on Middle Eastern crude oil and American liquid natural gas, we achieve the green dream. We blanket the continent in wind turbines, solar arrays, and grid-scale battery storage.
But we have not achieved energy independence.
No. Escaping dependence on Middle Eastern oil simply trades one vulnerability for another. A heavy reliance on China for the rare earth metals and cheap manufacturing needed for solar panels and batteries.
Because the entire physical infrastructure of the renewable transition is entirely dependent on a highly concentrated supply chain of rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper.
To build the permanent magnets inside the nacelle of an offshore wind turbine requires tons of neodymium and praseodymium.
And to build high-capacity electric vehicle batteries requires vast quantities of processed lithium and cobalt.
And the mining, refining, and manufacturing dominance of that entire vertical supply chain is currently monopolized by China.
So you're swapping a reliance on the unpredictable geopolitics of the Persian Gulf for a reliance on the strategic ambitions of Beijing.
The core vulnerability remains exactly the same. Western economies are fundamentally resource poor and import dependent.
The shape of the molecule changes from a hydrocarbon to a lithium ion, but the geopolitical leverage held over the economy remains absolute.
This creates a bizarre, almost tragic policy loop. To survive the current crisis, to prevent the agricultural sector from collapsing and the logistical supply chains from freezing, the government might have to subsidize the very fossil fuels they're trying to phase out.
Just to keep the transport sector and food supply chains alive.
Exactly. We are witnessing scenarios where states, desperate to prevent hyperinflation and social unrest, are forced to heavily subsidize the exact fossil fuel systems they have legislated out of existence simply because the new system is nowhere near ready to carry the load.
You are subsidizing the old paradigm just to ensure society survives long enough to build the new one.
It is a stunning realization of how deeply entangled our physical survival is with these vulnerable systems.
It really is. So to recap our journey today, we've gone from the illusion of a ceasefire on the water to the hidden premiums in the spot market, the complacency of governments who think they can outbuy China, the underestimated threat of a gas shortage, and the harsh reality that the green transition cannot save us today.
It's a lot to process.
It is. And I want to remind everyone listening why this matters to you. It's not just about the price at the pump. It's about the cost of groceries delivered by diesel trucks, the heating of your homes, and the vulnerability of living in a system that assumes money can solve physical shortages.
Which brings up a final lingering thought based on everything we've discussed today.
Please share it.
We've spent the last few decades building a global economy optimized for efficiency. Just-in-time delivery, buying the cheapest gas from the cheapest source, keeping minimal reserves.
Right.
But as this deep dive shows, efficiency is the enemy of resiliency.
Wow. Efficiency is the enemy of resiliency.
When the next shock comes, and it will, ask yourself,
Wow.
are we still just hoping the market will save us, or are we finally ready to pay the premium for genuine security?
That is a phenomenal question to end on. Thank you to everyone for joining this deep dive into the source material. We hope this gave you a lot to think about, and we invite you to keep questioning the headlines.
Thanks for listening.
Catch you next time.